Hi, in today's weekly debating practice, we are going to be learning about one of the basics debating strategy, which is defining. So first of all, what do we do at the very start of the debate? Of course, we do not go straight towards the argument. Instead, we have to build up the setups and divine things that we are going to be debating upon in the debate. So firstly, we have to learn how to define. There are several do's and don'ts and on to how to define your debate. Firstly, we have to identify what are we going to prove in this debate. Secondly, we have to define the necessary keywords in the motions. What I mean by necessary keywords is in most cases, there are some words that have ambiguous meanings, which is, for example, like heavily oppressed communities. What do we mean by heavily oppressed communities? You have to define those keywords in the motions, right? So you have to define it in a way which you give a literal meaning towards it. Thirdly, you can make the definition by explaining the opposite meaning of wording or sentence that is debated upon, right? When you do not have any idea into how to define things, then one of the tip is that you can explain that by explaining the opposite meaning of that wording or the sentence. Moving on towards the don'ts onto how to define things. Firstly, define the motion based on specific knowledge that is not common, meaning that you have to define the motion based on common knowledge and not just based on specific knowledge or any knowledge that only you understand it. You have to set up the debate by common knowledge, which means that people has to understand that. Also integrated into the second point, which is defining by using terms that people cannot understand, which means we have to explain things in the terms that people can understand, in common knowledge. Thirdly, we should not employ time and or setting by your definition. You should have given the context in the debatable and acceptable area. You cannot give a definition in which just give an advantage towards your group, right? You shouldn't define things and limit it towards the extent of giving disadvantage towards your opponent's team. So you have to give the context in debatable and acceptable areas so the debate can be clear and the debate can be fair. So moving on, there's a note here. If your opponent is giving incorrect definition, you can challenge the definition by saying that it is unacceptable and cannot be debated upon. There is several tips towards defining the motion. So before moving on towards the arguments and stuff, first of all, we have to set up the debate. Firstly, how do we set up? Firstly, we have to set up the background. Look carefully, where does the debate takes place? In giving background, we should also explain how is the status quo. So background and status quo is basically integrated in one another. Secondly, we have to explain about the status quo. Analyze the efforts in the status quo. Is the status quo enough to respond and or mitigate the problem? Or is the mechanism in the status quo is enough? So after explaining the background and status quo, we move on towards the problem. What are the problems that arise in that kind of situation? In the problems, we have to define there are several harmful actions, conflicting values, vulnerable people that are being disfranchised by certain actor or certain policy, and how the status quo is not enough for accomplishing the ideal world. These three I will explain to you in more specific way by at the very end. I will give an example. So moving on. In the setups, firstly, we have what's called stance. Stance is what you believe in on the debate and what side you're on. It should be bold, which means that you have to explain your stance in a very explicit way. If you are disagreeing upon something, you have to explicitly saying that we on our side we are disagreeing on the motion, or we are disagreeing onto several mechanisms, stuff like that. So stance has to be bold, has to be clear, so everyone can know which side you're on. Secondly, we have this so-called burden of proof, or BOP. It is something you have a duty to prove in order to win the debate. Defining your burden of proof will guide you to have a clear debate. So burden of proof, basically, your argument that, that your statement that you have to prove at the end of the debate. You have to prove that what your statement are saying, what you are saying about the statement is true or not. So moving on towards the example, I'll give you some example on how to set things up in the debate. Let's take a look at the motion. This House regrets the rise of financial services that specifically targets lower middle class, for example, credit, right? So how do I set up the background subsequent purpose? Firstly, on the background, on the motion specifically mentions that it will target lower middle class. So in these sections, we should explain the condition of lower middle class people. What are their behaviors and what are their concerns in the status quo? Basically, we are explaining about this lower middle class people, our vulnerable actor in this motion. Secondly, we're moving on towards the status quo. In the status quo, the alternative has been given to provide a better solution towards the lower middle class concern through the existence of these financial services that is all to help them, right? So I explained the status quo that the financial services exist to help this kind of lower middle class people to give a better solution towards their concerns, right? And we say, and moving on towards the problem, I say that the alternative in the status quo is not beneficial for these lower middle class people. In fact, it is mostly harmful for these lower middle class people. And we have to protect the vulnerable actor, in this case, lower middle class people, right? So how you integrate your background, status quo, and problems, it's in a systematical order, right? And this not also applies on the first speaker on to how you do the beginning of the debate. This also applies on to later on speakers. When you are building your argument, you have to explain the background and the status quo, and lastly, you have to explain the problem. Moving on towards the stance. So, for example, in these motions, in my stance, firstly, let's say I'm an affirmative team. My stance is I do not want any of these financial services to exist, and I still want to stick to conventional money borrowing mechanism, for example, through conventional banks or any other platforms that is more conventional rather than these financial services that are existing nowadays, right? So that is my stance as affirmative team. So what is my stance as negative team? That's very simple. My stance as negative team, I want these financial services to still exist, and I heavily advocating it. So that is so stance puts you in the position in which side you're on in a very explicit way. Moving on towards burden of proof. What is my burden of proof as affirmative team based on my stance? Right? So firstly, my burden of proof as affirmative team is financial services are harmful towards the vulnerable actor, and the conventional way is much more beneficial towards the vulnerable actor. So throughout my argument, I have to explain this burden of proof of mine. So moving on towards the negative side of the house, what is my burden of proof? My burden of proof is financial services are not harmful, and in fact, it is beneficial towards the vulnerable actor. That is so simple. That the burden of proof is based on the stance that you delivered in the very first place. So that's all for today's weekly practice, and thank you. Sudah Mi.